we're going to go ahead and get started. Thank you all for joining another Meetup Live. My name is Pat Patterson. I am a senior marketing manager here at Meetup. We're happy to have you here for another great session. Today, we are joined by our special guest, Dr. Miriam Kirmayer, for a lesson on building a robust and rewarding social circle. You'll learn how to make new friends, which is always important, deepen friendships you've already formed, and find connections who make your life a little more enjoyable. I think we can all stand to have a few more friends in our lives. You also hear some tangible tips for getting past the awkward phase of getting to know someone by being your authentic self. I know I could use some advice there as well. Before we get started, we're just going to share some guidelines for the event. So a couple quick items. This event's recorded, but don't worry, you will not appear in the video. I got a haircut because I'm in the video, but I'm sorry if you got a haircut too, but you will not be in the video, so no worries there if you didn't get one. Your audio will also be muted during the event, but if you have any questions, you can submit those questions in the Q&A feature here in Zoom. So we have that great feature here in Zoom. And also, if you want to see the closed captioning, we have that available. So to turn it on, you just go to the live transcription icon. It's at the bottom of your screen, and then you can select that preference to turn on the closed captioning. Awesome. Thanks for everybody who's just joined in too, and for telling us where you are in the comment section. We love to see that. Our agenda is pretty straightforward. I'm going to introduce Dr. Kirmayer. We're going to have a fireside chat, her and I guess it's more of a Zoom side chat. I don't know if there'll actually be a fire involved, but we'll have that conversation for about 40 minutes. And then, of course, we're going to open this up to Q&A. If you have those questions, like I mentioned beforehand, please drop those in the Q&A section of Zoom. Awesome. So without further ado, I'm going to introduce Dr. Miriam Kirmayer, who is a clinical psychologist and a leading friendship expert who has studied the science of connection for over a decade. Her work focuses on helping people to navigate life transitions, cultivate resilience and self-compassion, and build healthier relationships and more connected lives. Dr. Kirmayer is regularly featured in The Atlantic, Forbes, The New York Times, Time, and The Today Show. I've heard of those. She sits on the Mental Health Advisory Board for Wonderman, a media company co-founded by Selena Gomez, and partners with businesses and organizations to encourage well-being, meaningful relationships, and community. So welcome, please welcome Dr. Kirmayer. Dr. Kirmayer, how are you? And welcome to Meetup Live.
I'm doing well. How are you doing?
I'm doing great. I'm happy to talk to you today about the power of authentic friendships. I think especially nowadays, it's something that we could all, get a better understanding of in the times we're living in. So I really appreciate you being here today.
Yeah, no, I'm so looking forward to our conversation.
Awesome. I think the first question that I have, which is probably top of mind for a lot of people, is how would you define a friendship expert?
Yeah. I think it's one of those things. It's maybe easier to define by telling you not what it is, but what it's not, right? So one of the things that I've learned in my research and work on friendship is that our friendships are so unique, both compared to our other relationships that we have in our lives, but even friendship to friendship. And so what that means is that it's really hard to give clear rules or blueprints of here's how you should go about making friends or handling this one specific friendship challenge, right? So just because I'm a friendship expert and researcher doesn't mean I'm an expert on your friendship, right? And it also doesn't mean that I don't struggle in my own life, because there's so much that goes into making friends and maintaining friends and letting go of friendships. And I know that we're going to talk about a lot of that. And so I like to share that because I think that word expert carries with it a certain connotation. Sure. I can tell you now what it does mean. It means that I've studied the science of friendship, as you said before, for over a decade, working to answer questions about what are the best practices we have when it comes to meeting new people, building, fulfilling authentic connections, and again, supporting the important people in our lives and making sure that we're benefiting from healthy relationships and friendships.
I love that. You have a lot of experience studying this, so we definitely appreciate your insight here. What age range do you typically work with as a quote unquote friendship expert?
Yeah. So after studying friendship, I then went on to, I'm a practicing clinical psychologist. So I have a private practice. And part of the work that I do is I see clients in therapy, and I see people, of a variety of backgrounds and ages, and who are struggling with a variety of life experiences. I would say for the most part in my therapy practice, I work a lot with young adults and with people who are at some kind of critical juncture or going through a particular life transition. So whether that's, starting a new school program or a new job or moving cities or entering into a new relationship or parenthood or ending a relationship, those are moments where our mental health can struggle, but so too can our relationships. And so that really ends up being a big focus of the work that I do clinically. And then obviously in a lot of the speaking and writing and consulting work that I do, I'm working with people across the board, which is really fun.
Yeah, it's really interesting. When I think about making friends, the first memories I have are when I'm younger, right? And I'm in grade school and I'm having the awkward conversations. But it seems like you're leaning towards younger adults and the adult range. Why did you decide to help adults instead of, I guess, the younger age range?
Yeah, so a few reasons. Certainly, in the world of research, there's a lot of work that looks at not just why friendships are important, but how can we help kids and youth to make close, healthy friendships. And that ends up being a big focus of how society is structured too, right? We're enrolling our kids in extracurricular activities. At school, the focus is really on helping kids to develop healthy friendships. And what we see is that our friendships are no less important the older we get. In fact, they actually become more important than some of our other relationships when it comes to our mental health and physical well-being and even how long we live. But there weren't great systems of support in place to actually help us do that. And so after I had done some of this research in this area, I was noticing that I was getting a lot of questions from adult clients looking for information, hungry for information about how do I navigate the world of adult friendships. And there weren't great systems of support available. So that was kind of the catalyst for pursuing this work in a more applied sense.
That's great. And it's interesting to see how long you've been doing this for. I think it probably hasn't, it probably isn't a new phenomenon, but you can see it more often on social media. People are sharing information on, how to become or how to find friends as an adult. So It's probably just more prevalent now that people are sharing it more often, but it's great to see that you have, that you've discovered this area and have spent more time on it the past 10 years. I'm curious, in terms of the friendships that adults are having, what do they tend to struggle with the most? What aspects of friendship do you see adults struggle with the most?
Yeah, so I kind of said this before, but there's obviously so many different skills that go into navigating adult friendships and so many different types of scenarios that can come up that there isn't just one challenge that we can experience. And also it's inevitable that we will struggle with some type of friendship experience in our lives. I would say the three main categories that come up, the first is making friends, both in terms of the practical piece of how do I do that, but also kind of the self-confidence and self-assuredness that needs to go into that to connect with the right people in healthy ways. Second piece is about communication, right? We emphasize the importance of communication, openness, honesty, transparency in our romantic relationships so often, and we don't necessarily have those same kinds of conversations or expectations in our friendship. And so it's really hard for people to set boundaries, ask for what we need, let a friend know when how they're showing up for us isn't as helpful as we expect, negotiating conflict. So all of that ends up being very important. And then the last piece is the friendship dissolution or breakup piece, both in terms of how do we go about doing that and also how do we cope? Because for many people, that is a very real loss in their lives that often goes under-acknowledged and unnoticed.
Right. So making friends, communication, and then I guess friendship breakups. That's how I'm gonna.
Yeah.
Interesting. It's interesting how adults can struggle with things the same way anyone else does. Like if any different age range, like people don't necessarily maybe talk about it as much. I'm interested in I'll give an example. I have a friend I made a couple weeks ago named Danny. I met playing basketball at the local gym around here. And I guess we're in that awkward stage where we're acquaintances, but we're not yet close friends. I'm curious, what advice you have for me on how do you move, or anyone else in that kind of situation where you move from, you've just sort of met and your acquaintances. How do you get to that first stage where you start to become friends?
Yeah. So I love that you asked this question because the name of my blog with Psychology Today is Casual to Close, all about how do we move from casual acquaintances to close friends, because it is such a challenge for so many of us. And I think that the success here is really tied to our ability and willingness to tolerate discomfort, because it is really awkward and uncomfortable. And the more we can kind of sit in that and acknowledge it, the better able we are to move through that. But what happens is so often we feel that discomfort, we feel a little awkward or vulnerable, shy, anxious, and we don't like those feelings. And so we close ourselves off from future conversations or moments of connection. And there's some really interesting research here showing that we can actually quantify how many hours it takes to build a friendship. And so it takes about 50 hours to move to kind of this casual friendship that we're discussing, 100 hours to move to a closer friendship, and about 200 hours to move to a best friend. And so we really do need to put in the time. And a lot of people hope, understandably, and expect that friendships will just happen, that we'll have that spark, we'll have that moment of connection, and we'll just hit it off and go from there. That happens sometimes, but more often than not, we need to both spend time together and have that consistency and frequency, and be intentional with what we're doing in our time together and how we're connecting.
No, it's really interesting. It seems like it's with anything else, you have to put the work in to develop it into something further. I also was thinking when I asked that question, hopefully Danny's not on this.
Yeah, hi, Danny.
It'll be a little awkward. I don't know, Danny, if you're here and you want to become better friends, drop it in the comments.
Well, you know what? I love what you just did there, because, I think people are very, again, understandably uncomfortable with the idea of being open and transparent about our desire to make friends, right? But more often than not, we can sense when there's a bit of reciprocity, right? When somebody else is interested in getting to know us, when we share something common. And when the timing is right, being upfront about how much you enjoy spending time together and that you'd like to get together in a different context, or you'd like to become friends, people respond to that type of assertiveness, and it can be incredibly disarming, and people are relieved because it's so hard to do. And so there is value in doing that in kind of a appropriate way when the timing is right.
Sure. No, I think it's really good advice, like being open and vulnerable, and honest about, what your intentions are. It's interesting. You mentioned when you're talking about the stages of making friends, like the communication piece, you mentioned like making sure you have, and this is part of that, like making sure you can set boundaries. Like, do you have any advice on, how do you set boundaries when you're making those friendships?
Yeah, so this is an interesting question, because I think it's come up a lot recently in the context of people navigating and negotiating different social situations, especially as it pertains to the pandemic and people feeling comfortable with in-person gatherings or online gatherings, and returning to some of those unfamiliar yet also familiar situations. I think when it comes to boundaries, there are two big problems that often get in the way of it being communicated or received. The first is that we expect the people close to us, including our friends, to know what it is we need or what we're thinking. And that gets us into trouble, because our friends know a little bit about us, but they don't have necessarily the same lens through which they view the world. And so the clearer we can be, both in terms of what's working and what's not working for us, the more likely the message is to be received. And then the second thing is, sometimes we say it very clearly, but we say it once and expect them to understand or remember or put it into practice. And so it does take a little bit of responsibility and initiative to say it clearly and say it consistently. And that really helps the message to be received. Of course, sometimes people aren't respectful of our boundaries, and that's a different conversation. But when it comes to setting those boundaries, say it clearly and say it again.
No, I think that's a really good point. I love what you said about like everybody is coming from things from a different perspective and a different lens. I think I'm trying to remember that more often. Like, not everybody thinks the same way I think, and it is good to take a step back and think about it from another person's perspective, and really understand that they're not always going to hear what you're saying this exact same way. So I love that, setting expectations and not just believing the other person knows how you're feeling without actually saying it up front. I love that advice.
Right, exactly. The other thing that I think is important to note is I said this before, but we don't have to give our friends complete access to our internal world, right? Meaning we don't have to apologize for setting boundaries and explain exactly what's going on. But one theme that comes up in our friendships is that the people around us, because they care about us, they will often personalize boundaries and this also has a bit to do with how we're taught to set and respect boundaries of more macro sense. But the more we can express to a friend that this boundary isn't because we are pushing them away, but because it's an effort to preserve the friendship and because we value that friendship, that too can be very helpful for fostering that closeness over time.
Right. Now, that's a really good point too. I haven't thought of it that way before. I love that piece of advice. You did mention the pandemic, and I hate not to mention it or talk about it because I think it's obviously affected the world in a dramatic way and affected relationships. How do you think the pandemic has affected the way that people communicate in friendships? I guess is part one of the question, and the second part, which is related. And do you think it's made people, more or less social?
Yeah. Yeah, this is a big topic. I mean, I think that,
Sure.
yeah, right. One we can all relate to in different ways. And my guess is, for people joining us here today, that again, different friendships have been affected in different ways. I think one of the big takeaways that is positive is that we are more aware of our universal need for connection, and we're having more conversations about how important it is to have close, meaningful friendships and to invest in that need for connection. People are also more open about the extent to which they're feeling lonely or disconnected from their friends, from their communities, from the people around them. And I think that there's value in that because it helps to normalize it. And the more we talk about it, the more we can mobilize ourselves into action and do something about it. And so I think
that's today, right? This
right, exactly. Exactly. So I think that's really positive. One of the themes that I'm noticing in my work, though, is that there is no one true or right friendship experience here. And so I'm certainly hearing from people who are experiencing greater feelings of loneliness and disconnection, feel as though they're losing touch with friends, or their friendships are being strained, again, because of different perspectives or values or needs. There are other people who are seeing this as an opportunity to really reflect on which are the friendships that I want to be prioritizing right now, and how can I make them work? And so some friendships are becoming much closer and some friendships are becoming much more distant. And there really is no one right way to be here. I think the friendships that are most likely to last and to become increasingly fulfilling are those where people are willing to have conversations about what's really going on in their lives and how they want to manage these differences or the strains on the friendship. And so being open about what's working, what's not working, how can we communicate in healthy, effective ways? Are you satisfied with how we're connecting? And I also think this idea of creativity is so important. The more newness and excitement and creativity we can bring to our friendships, the, again, more fulfilling they are. And so sometimes that means changing up how we're communicating, what we're talking about, seeing each other in different settings, if possible. All of those things really help to bring a feeling of momentum to the friendship. Because I think a lot of people for a long time have felt both incredibly anxious, but also feeling that sense of monotony at the same time. And those two things are very difficult. And I guess, we'd be remiss to not mention the impact of screen time too, right? That when work is taking place through a screen and our social time is taking place through a screen, that becomes very, very draining and less rewarding sometimes.
Yeah, it becomes draining. Just, the act of doing it, and then like the physicality of like the screen. I have these blue light glasses, that I wear every so often when I'm staring at the screen as well. I just want to go back to the previous question I asked you and how it relates to the pandemic. So we were talking about like setting boundaries. Do you think that people are, you mentioned that people are like now opening up to the idea of, or expressing their feelings more about how they're lonely? Do you think it's easier for people to set boundaries now with the pandemic as well? I think that's becoming part of it, maybe like making it easier to have that conversation?
I don't know that it's necessarily easier for everyone. I think it's certainly important. And I think that there is that greater awareness on some level of how necessary those are when it comes to both our physical safety, but also just our psychological sense of safety and feeling as though we can, again, be ourselves and be true to our life circumstances with the people around us. And so a lot of people are struggling to set those boundaries, but feeling that tension because they also know how important they are for ourselves, but also, again, for our friendships, because that's what allows us to continue to stay connected in a healthy way.
Right. And then another question. So people who are, who have been friends over time through the pandemic, and maybe they had a lot of screen time and now they're getting back together. Do you have any examples or advice on, bringing new life to the friendship, like bringing some newness there, resparking that, original connection?
Yeah. That's such an interesting question. So, because I think a lot of people are relating to that right now, right? And again, managing the anxiety that comes with this reintegration and coming together that hasn't been there for a long time for many people. I think when it comes to bringing in that energy and momentum and newness, there are different ways to do that, but the similarity is kind of broadening the context in which your friendship is taking place. So sometimes that might mean talking about something new that you haven't shared before, being disclosing in that sense and connecting over a new topic. Sometimes that might mean trying a new activity that you've never done together. Sometimes that might mean doing something that's a little bit physically exhilarating, right? I mean, I don't know that my advice is necessarily go out and ride a roller coaster with a friend, although I think that there's a lot, that sounds great and is really fun. But the more you can think of activities like that on some level that will be activating in a way that feels fun and exciting for you, because not everyone loves roller coasters, right?
Right.
The more that energy gets kind of transferred onto the person that we're with. And so that too can be really helpful. Sometimes that's physical exercise. That means that's going to a new place and experiencing that excitement, but having those new exciting experiences and sharing those with somebody that we care about is also very, very impactful.
Yeah, I love that response to it. I think I've seen that a bit just in my work in marketing at Meetup, just hearing from Meetup members and organizers where, they may have, gone to a group event that's, I'm just making up an example about hiking, but then they realize, hey, we also in common, we both love comedy movies. So they'll go see a movie. I think that's interesting that you put it that way. I mean, you can broaden your scope, like you said, of interests that you have in common, because if you have one thing in common that you guys are friends about, it's likely there's probably other layers there. It's probably not just one thing, it's like you can only hike together, and that's it.
Right. Well, and you're touching on something so important there. And that's the reality that similarity is typically the starting point or the root of friendship. I notice something about you that I recognize in myself, whether that is an interest in hiking or a similar perspective in terms of a situation or a similar life experience. And that helps to set the stage for feelings of connectedness early on. Very often, and I think you're touching on this too, that can be necessary, but not sufficient, right? There's more that goes into building a friendship, because there's other people with whom we share things in common that we would not consider friends and we would not necessarily want to be friends with. And so it's helpful, but we need to then broaden the friendship, broaden the context in which it's playing out.
Right. I love that. Danny, if you are on, I have other interests besides basketball as well. If you want to talk about it after at a different time.
I love that.
We mentioned for a second kind of like Zoom and fatigue there that people have gone through, like just on the same kind of tone, or the same like thought layer, like in terms of screen time. Like obviously people are on social media quite a bit. That's even part of my job, right? Is marketing people on social media. How has the increase of social media, you think, changed the way people approach their friendships now in like negative, positive, or whatever way you've seen?
Yeah. Oh, this is really interesting, because there's new research coming out on this all the time. And we tend to think of the role of technology or social media in our lives when it comes to our mental health and relationships. We tend to think of that in a very binary way, right? This is helpful or this is harmful. And I think that there's so much nuance here. It can be helpful and harmful, and it can depend on the context, and it can depend on the friendship. I mean, thank goodness on the one hand that we have technology for so many reasons, especially given everything that's happened in the last few years, that we're able to stay connected and get access to information and feel close to the people around us. So social media and technology and online communities and platforms are so important for meeting new people, for staying connected, for building that closeness over time. But again, we need to be intentional with how we do that. And I think it does us a disservice when we're interacting in a very passive way, when we're not showing up intentionally or thoughtfully, and when we're mindlessly scrolling, right? And I think the most dangerous piece of that is scrolling mindlessly while also making internal assumptions about other people's lives and what that says about our own. Comparison, that's incredibly detrimental. And the pressure that people feel to kind of put forth this overly curated image of their lives, that again does very little when it comes to building true, authentic connections.
Yeah, I think that's a great piece of advice, just being intentional with how you're using social media. Like I was able to grow up, as a millennial where I didn't have social media, and then I got to college and I had, so I've experienced kind of both worlds. Another example, I met someone else at the gym the other day who went to the same college as I did, And, as an example, what you just said, I shared my Instagram handle with him and he shares with mine in case, we wanted to get in touch as like a less personal way of from sharing our number. And
Absolutely.
it was just, we're being intentional how we're using it, but I'm not gonna, I don't intend to like stalk his profile and, make assumptions. I think it is really about, using, not blaming the device or the social media, but also making sure you're using it with the right intentions behind it. So I love that piece of advice.
Exactly. And I think that's a self-reflection piece, right? How do I feel before, during, and after using it? What's my goal for entering into this moment of scrolling? Am I engaging with this and using this to connect, or am I using this to pass the time?
Sure.
Yeah, I think those are important questions for us to ask ourselves.
That's great. No, I think we're having an awesome conversation. So I really appreciate it. I'm getting a lot of good advice too. Hopefully everybody else is.
Well, I mean, you're giving plenty of tips in terms of how we can meet friends, right? I think you should definitely consider yourself an expert here too.
I don't know. I have a few friends. I was in a fraternity house for 4 years in college. So just being close with, my fraternity brothers, I'm sure, it's just experience talking to people, I think is a good thing to have. And with the diverse sets of people as well. And I'm more of an extrovert. So I don't know if that makes it easier or less easy. I don't want to, make any assumptions there, but I have no problem going out and talking to somebody. For those people, who may be on the call who are maybe consider themselves more of introverts, do you have any recommendations, maybe how to, start a conversation? Like, I don't know if you have like top tips, to start a conversation with someone else. Yeah.
So I think there's two pieces to this question, right? The first is what are top tips for approaching somebody, and then the second piece is this idea of introversion versus extroversion.
Sure. Yeah.
So let's stick with the tips first. I think we touched on a big one before, which is highlighting a similarity, right? And we don't want to go overboard here, right? With we share this in common and this in common, this in common. But if we can subtly and gently point out, oh, hey, I also have a child around the same age, or I also love to go hiking on the weekend. Here's actually this trail that I just went up the other day. Point that out, and you give somebody an opening to both see you as somebody they could potentially be friends with and respond in kind by opening up a little bit themselves in terms of what their experiences and likes are. And so pointing at a similarity is incredibly helpful. Second idea would really be to solicit, because nobody likes unsolicited advice, right? But to solicit some type of input or some type of recommendation or feedback, because that communicates, I value you and I value your judgment. So for example, asking somebody if they have a recommendation of a hike to do, or a restaurant that they could go to, or asking for feedback on a work assignment, right? That all communicates a certain level of interest, and it gives you a great opening for a follow-up conversation, right? It's not a one of, by the way, I did that trail you recommended last weekend and it was amazing. I loved it. Do you have anything else to recommend, or let me share one with you? And it's that back and forth over time that is really important for friendship development. And so I think those are two good ways to do it. In terms of the introversion extroversion piece, I think you said something really important there too. There are a lot of misconceptions when it comes to introversion and extroversion. And sometimes the differences are really exaggerated when they're, we share more in common. And one of the things that we do share in common is the extent to which we need friendship and connection, and the extent to which we benefit from it. The specifics will vary in terms of where do I feel comfortable? How do I want to connect with people? Is it one-on-one? Is it in a big group? And I think one of the big pieces that often gets missed is the success in the moment is also tied to what we do before and after. Meaning, if you are somebody who feels really overwhelmed in big social gatherings, first of all, consider if you really need to constantly put yourself in that situation, or if there's something else you can do when it comes to making friends, right? Sometimes there are necessities, but sometimes there's not. But also, how are you kind of replenishing yourself and your energy afterward? And how are you gearing up for this event before? Can you develop some kind of a ritual for getting into the right headspace, for relaxing in a way that's going to help you to go into this event feeling a little bit calmer and more collected? And I think the big thing to point out here too is that introversion is not always the same thing as shyness or anxiety. And that, I think, is one of those big misconceptions. Sure, there's overlap, but you can also be incredibly gregarious and extroverted and outgoing and still be shy and still suffer from social anxiety. So I think, yeah, parsing these things out can be really helpful for answering the question of what do I do? How do I have success here?
Right. No, I'm really glad you pointed that out and made the distinction and talked about kind of the misconceptions there. I think that's important. And I love the piece of advice you gave too about, how do you strike up a conversation? I think it's something that, I mean, Meetup is almost, founded on based, the first thing you mentioned was this, finding a common interest. And the other piece of advice I like a lot too, just asking, soliciting, advice from someone or opinion. I feel like you're right. If somebody asks me for something, I feel more valued. And then, there is a possibility to continue that conversation. So I love that as well. I have another question for you around, and I'll give an example too. So I'm traveling back to my hometown, or not my hometown. I grew up in Cleveland, moved to Indiana for 14 years. Now I'm in New York City, in Manhattan. I'm going back to Indiana where my family is, and I'm going to see some friends who I've been friends with for, maybe 12 years now, who I graduated from college with. Do you have any tips for how to, have to not just rekindle that friendship, but we've been friends for a while, have deeper conversations with these people, to extend the conversation deeper, I guess.
Yeah. I think a lot of the tips that we talked about before apply here, because one of the things that happens when we've been friends for a really long time, but also when we've known each other for a really long time, but haven't necessarily connected recently, is we tend to function on autopilot, right? Meaning there are either certain types of questions that we ask people, in those situations, or there are certain types of conversations that we have with these same people over and over and over again. And that familiarity can be helpful because it brings with it a sense of comfort. But I think we really want to push ourselves to ask something real, to ask something new, to step outside of that reflexive autopilot way of functioning in our relationships and engage. And sometimes that means leading by example, right? And when somebody asks you how you're doing, we don't have to just say, I'm fine, how are you doing? Or I'm great, how are you doing, right? Give a bit more detail, give an opening to either carry the conversation forward or an invitation for the other person to do the same. And I think that act of self-disclosure, again, sharing what's real, sharing what's important, sharing what's true, that is how we deepen our friendships. Certainly, that's how we experience that greater intimacy and closeness. And in terms of rekindling afterward, follow up, right? If this is somebody that you want to maintain a connection with or deepen your relationship with, let them know how much you enjoyed connecting. Gratitude, the expression of gratitude, both to somebody else and within ourselves, is one of the ways that we can experience greater satisfaction in our relationships.
Oh, wow. Yeah. No, I think that's really, really well said. I think I felt that before, experiencing or showing gratitude. It definitely makes you feel, a little bit better as well. Actually, I'm going to take that piece of advice too. I have a friend who I joke around with my partner with. He messages me once a week, and he's back in Indiana. He says, "How's New York?" And that's what he says every week. And I'm like, dude, it's the same as it was before, but, maybe I shouldn't, taking your advice, I should probably instead not laugh it off and say everything's great, but change the conversation, maybe ask how he's doing or.
Yeah. And I mean, maybe that's one strategy, except, as you're sharing that story and you're smiling, thinking of this memory, I think that's potentially a really good example of how those rituals or traditions within our friendship help us to feel close, right? It's one of those little things that you expect, is coming. Here it is. It's a reminder that this person's thinking of you. It's a reminder to you to think of them. And so there's value in that too. We don't always want to be in this state of newness or improving or strengthening our friendships. Sometimes we just want to be in the moment and live it. Yeah,
that's very true. And he's someone who I was in close contact with, I saw every other week when I was living in Indiana, and now I'm in New York. I don't see him as often. So it is a piece of connection that, keeps the thread of conversation going, keeps, I guess I'm grateful that he's keeping me, top of mind. So I think that's awesome. Yeah, for sure. Actually, that's probably, I have another question, and it might be a question other people have, and maybe something you've already touched upon, but maybe there's other pieces of advice you can add as well. For those who are maybe moving to a new city, so, I've moved to New York 3 years ago. I wouldn't say I'm as new, although like I can go to a different borough and I feel like I don't know where I am at all. But when you move
That's
to
what's
a new
amazing about
city,
New York. Yeah.
right? It is pretty amazing. That's why I love it here. Um, but do you have any specific tactics, I guess, if you move to a new city, how to
Yeah.
find new friends?
Yeah. Yes. I think I said this before when you asked what are some of the main challenges that come up in friendships. This is one theme that comes up time and time again because it is really hard. And I think we don't do enough to prepare ourselves or each other beforehand, right? Going into a situation, I think it is helpful to know that this will potentially be a struggle and to normalize and validate that's not something that's wrong with you, or you're not doing this move in a incorrect way. That's just one of the challenges that comes with moving cities. So I think it's important to be validating and compassionate to ourselves about that struggle. In terms of how to connect with new people, I think the two best tips that I can give you, one is to utilize your existing social network, right? Ask
Sure.
people, if you're moving to New York and you happen to know somebody in New York, or you know somebody who knows somebody in New York, right? Let them know that you are looking to make friends, or you're looking for help figuring out where to live or what neighborhoods to explore, and have somebody set you up and connect you with somebody new, because the chances are you might share something in common with this person if you have somebody in common in your lives. And it can be a very good starting point, right? They don't have to be the one friend you make. You don't have to hit it off with this person, but it can make that transition a little bit easier in the beginning and give you a bit of a boost so that you feel comfortable putting yourself out there and meeting new people in other ways. But I think that is the key, right? Again, friendships don't just happen. We need to be intentional. We need to be thoughtful. And so find a community or an event through Meetup or somewhere else where you're able to meet people. And here's the key, connect with them on a ongoing basis, right? Because again, we might attend a one-of lecture or wine tasting or concert or whatever it is, but that might not be enough to get a friendship off the ground. And so the best activities are going to be ones where we can meet people with whom we share things in common, but also connect with again. And if that's not built into the structure of the activity, then initiate. Again, we so often wait for somebody else to make the first move or to take the lead in friendship formation. And one of the common themes in my work is people feel like they're doing a lot of that, and we sometimes overestimate the extent to which we're initiating. So initiate more than you think you should.
Yeah, no, I definitely agree with you there. And I appreciate the Meetup plug. I think I'd be remiss if I didn't mention, Meetup is a great place for that as a marketer at Meetup. And then I think what you said earlier too is a good point about, I'm going to bring back the point about social media, right? So if you're moving to a new city and you know somebody who already lives there, or even if your network, you don't know if somebody knows somebody, they may have moved, that's how you can use your social media network. I did that when I first moved to New York 3 years ago. I sent a message out saying, I'm relocating. Does anybody, have any recommendations, or friends that I can connect with? And I specifically talked about different things I was interested in. So I think, it can be social media is a good or bad thing, depending on how you intend to use it. I think that's a good way to use it as well. I have one more question for you, and then I don't want to make this all about me getting all the advice I can from you. Hopefully, I'm just kidding. I know these questions apply to everybody, but I want to make sure I can ask the questions that we have. We had a lot of questions coming as well, but I have one more for you, because you mentioned before that some people, have social anxiety. I myself, I think people are more commonly even saying that and coming out and admitting that they have that social anxiety. I have had a lot of anxiety in the past. Over time I've developed, more comfort and, being more vocal and, being even on this Meetup Live podcast, this Meetup Live event. What is your advice for those who face social anxiety? And then how can they become more comfortable, I guess, in situations?
Yeah. So I think again, a lot of the tips that I have here were woven into some of the other things that we spoke about. I think first and foremost, we really want to acknowledge that making friends can be very awkward and uncomfortable, and it can bring with it a lot of anxiety, and that you are not alone in feeling this, because when we feel anxious, we tend to judge ourselves for that, and we end up feeling incredibly isolated. And when we feel isolated, what we do is we tend to isolate ourselves even more. And so we end up in this vicious cycle where we we are feeling increasingly anxious and disconnected. And so I think we really want to validate it. This is normal. You are not the only one feeling this. It's okay that you feel this way too, because I think that's a key piece here. A lot of people feel like, well, because I'm anxious, I won't be able to be confident enough or witty enough or eloquent enough that I'll make friends. And that's absolutely not true. You can own your awkwardness in a way that really, really lends itself to connection, right? You don't have to have the perfect opening line or comeback in order to make friends. So I think that's one piece of it. Again, what are you doing before and after? Before, to mentally prepare yourself, to make yourself feel a little bit more relaxed. Breathing exercises can be helpful here. And afterward, make sure you validate that you did that, right? That was hard and you did it. Those post attributions are so, so important. And so we really want to look at our self-talk, but also what we're doing, because making friends, maintaining friendships, these are skills. And the more we practice them, the more confident and comfortable we feel doing it. So start small, go to a group setting, or maybe getting together one-on-one with a friend is the next step for you. Figure out what your next step is, start there, and build that confidence and competence over time.
Yeah, I think that's really good advice. I think definitely, when building habits too, it's good to start small and manage expectations for yourself.
Yes.
And then when things become more comfortable, to grow that as well. And the piece of advice you had about, like owning your awkward self, I think that's great too. I mean, like, I feel like you should be yourself no matter what, and I think that's one thing I love about Meetup. As a Meetup member going to events, like people are inclusive, and I feel like you shouldn't put on a mask. I mean, you should put on a mask, the other sense of the mask, but you shouldn't have to be somebody else, right? Yeah. Own who you are, and then you're more likely to meet people who have common interests, right?
Exactly. And I think I'll end off on this note because it's so, so important. Part of what separates our friendships from our other relationships is that they're voluntary, right? We are choosing who to connect with, and our friends in turn are choosing to connect with us and choosing to stay connected. And that's why our friendships are so valuable, so important. And that's also why being our authentic self is so important, because we want to feel chosen for who we are, not who we think we should be or have to be.
Yeah, definitely agree. I love that. Awesome. Well, I appreciate you answering those questions that I had in our Zoom side chat, but I do have quite a few questions coming in from people who are listening. So I'm glad that everyone is being engaged. And I'll go ahead and just go through these. I know we only have, so much time left in this session. So Heidi asks, I am in my 40s and wonder, where do you go to find new friends, especially when you're not working?
Yeah. So this is a good question, because for many people, work is the place where we connect with friends, right? But that's not because there's necessarily something so necessary about making friends there, although the importance of workplace friendships is so important. But all that to say, why that's one of the key places is for two reasons. One is because we are there again repeatedly, right? So there's that repeated interaction. There's a social support, a social system in place to help us connect. We don't have to go out of our way every day to invite somebody to get together. We know we're going to see them in this context, but also because work is collaborative, right? There's the opportunity very often to team up on something, a group project, a presentation, a volunteering initiative. And so we can use that information to our advantage. We can think about, what do I value? I think values are so tied to our friendships. It's not just what am I interested in, but what do I care about? And use that as the guide to find activities, experiences, volunteering initiatives that you can join and connect with other people on an ongoing basis to build those friendships.
Yeah, I love that you talked about, how, you acknowledge the fact that work you have so much in common, like inherently, because you're in the same place. And I think a lot of people choose to work in a particular organization at times because they have similar values that the organization has. So they have things in common already, but you can still find that connection outside of work, right?
Exactly.
Yeah, for sure.
Exactly. That's what I was trying to say, that you said much more eloquently.
Oh, no, I did not. I was just repeating back what you had said.
No, that's exactly it. But again, I don't want to, I think it's important to circle back to this, that there's a lot of research coming out about the value of workplace friendships, that it actually leads to better, both kind of satisfaction at work and well-being, but also productivity and engagement. And I think that's a really exciting area for us to be thinking about.
For sure. Yeah. I mean, if you like people that you spend most of your day with, I'm sure it aids in the working like environment and getting work done. I mean, I can see that with my team. Shout out to the marketing team if you guys are on the call. I'll go to the next question from Priscilla. Do you have any tips for retirement age folks who are making friendships in a new community without a pair bonded partner?
Yeah. Yeah. So there's so much important stuff to talk about here. I think the most important thing to emphasize is that you can still do this, right? Because there can be a lot of challenges for people, depending on the reason why they're showing up to a situation without a partner. Meaning, sometimes we're dealing with grief and loss. Sometimes we just feel like a bit of an outsider because the people around us are showing up as a pair. But that doesn't take away from our ability to forge meaningful connections. And so I think we really want to think about how can I set myself up for success here? Meaning, would bringing somebody along who I trust and who I get along with and who might enjoy this type of an activity or setting, be it another friend or a family member, would that help me in my mission of making other friends? Or the truth is, for a lot of people, bringing somebody else along ends up being a bit of a crutch, right? Because what happens? We end up speaking to the person that we came with all the time, as opposed to speaking with other people. And so sometimes putting yourself in a situation where you are flying solo, so to speak, is really, really helpful because there's a bit more ideally helpful momentum that pushes you to connect with the people who are there. I guess the other piece of this would be, what are the types of situations that you want to be in, right? Do you want to be in a situation where you are connecting with other people who are also flying solo? And can you seek out those types of experiences? But to really focus on, it's less about who you're with and more about how you yourself are showing up.
Yeah, that's a really good way to end that off. I think I agree with you. Sometimes, if I'll bring my girlfriend to an event, I'll notice I'm talking to her more often than everyone else. So I think that's really being intentional about, what you want to do in that environment. I love that piece of advice as well. You have all these great pieces of advice. Hopefully a lot of people are taking away the same things I am. I'm going to keep on. I do too. I'm glad I could join you in this. I'm going to ask another question. This one's interesting. It's from an anonymous attendee. But what type of impact does your friendship have on how long you live?
Yes. Okay. So unsurprisingly, I'm very passionate about talking about this.
Sure.
This is something that I emphasize in all the speaking work that I do in my online community on Instagram, where I share a lot of this type of information and takeaways. And I'm going to just say the quote because I think it really drives this home. We think of our friendships as a nicety, but really they're a necessity. We think of our friendships as something that's nice to indulge in, that feels good. But I think I said this before, our friendships are one of the most important predictors of how healthy we are and how long we live, on par with whether we drink, whether we smoke, how much we exercise, what we eat, our genetics. Investing in our need for social connection is one of the most powerful predictors of how healthy we are and how long we live. And so when we have a healthy social network, we're less likely to suffer from chronic health conditions. Our immune system is boosted. We're less likely to suffer from the common cold. Our lifespan is increased. I could go on and on, but really our cognitive functioning is improved. Our mental health is improved. And so I think we really want to be thinking about how are we meeting that need for connection.
Yeah, that's great. And do you mind if I use all of that for Meetup marketing?
No, you can't.
I'm just kidding. I'm just joking, obviously. But yeah, I mean, that's so important. Like, I mean, when I think about my own happiness, the first couple of things I think about is, my friendships that I have in my own life. So I love that.
Yeah.
I appreciate how passionate you are about that too.
I will, because again, I think historically friendships have really fallen under that umbrella of this is a nice relationship. In some ways, this is a fluffy relationship, right? We're lucky if we have a few friends, but we really do need those connections. And I think the narrative about friendships is shifting, and that's not to put pressure on people who feel like their social circle isn't where they'd like it to be, right? Because it's not about the size of our network. It's not even about how often we see our friends. Having just one friend actually helps us to reap those benefits. And so being deliberate about curating a close but not necessarily large social group is the way to live some of these benefits.
Yeah, I think that's a good point too. The closeness part, right? Rather than how large it is. Awesome.
Yeah.
I'll keep moving through because there's a lot of questions. I
Sure, go for
apologize
it.
if I don't answer your specific questions. I think some of these we've already covered when we had our chat. Let me find one that's, so this is related to, we touched on it a little bit, related to, the world we're living in now, which is a little more virtual. So how do you move from a friendship that may have started as a virtual friendship into an in-person friendship?
Yeah. It reminds me of something that you said before in terms of, I think it was the friend that you met maybe at the gym where you exchanged Instagram handles. I think we want to be mindful of the fact that there are different levels to connecting, right? There are different stages or phases. And for some people, connecting on the phone, for example, or through a Zoom call feels much more personal than texting. Or for some people, getting an email can feel really personal because it's your personal email and you're not used to having somebody show up in your inbox unexpectedly. So I think we can use that to our advantage by thinking about how can I take this friendship to the next level? It doesn't have to be 0 to 100, right? It doesn't have to be, this is an online friendship and suddenly we're now meeting up for a coffee date if that feels too big or too scary to do or to invite somebody along to. It can be, let's set up a Zoom call where we can watch this game together virtually, or can I call you for a quick sec? I know we've been texting, but I really want to update you about a situation, and move your friendship to the next level in that way, and eventually get to a place where having that in-person moment of connection doesn't feel like the huge jump that it might have initially.
Yeah, I think that's a good point too. The way that I read it was almost, the in-person friendship is the better friendship than the virtual, but I think you're right. Like everybody has differences about, what they assume is a closer relationship.
Yeah, there's some interesting research in this space too. I think the takeaway is we still need in-person friendships, that
right, for sure.
Online connections and moments of connection are not a replacement for that in-person energy or for those in-person friendships. At the same time, there's a lot of value that we get from online interactions, and there's ways that we can move through those interactions that again helps us to feel closer and more connected.
Right.
What
I
we
guess
talked about, and even, sorry, I was just gonna say there's actually some interesting research too showing things like giving somebody a virtual high five through the screen, that actually conveys or we experience similar internal experiences if that high five was in person.
Oh yeah, that's awesome. Do you want to do one real quick? I don't know.
Let's do it.
All right, there we go. Awesome. Thanks for indulging me. This question is, I don't know, maybe a little bit related to the last one. This is called, the Meetup Live is called The Power of Authentic Relationships. This person's just asking real quick, what's the difference between an authentic relationship and an unauthentic relationship?
Yeah. So you know what? I will answer this by saying that you get to decide, right? That nobody else but you can decide what feels like a true, genuine, and authentic connection. I think the similar experience or the important takeaway is something that we talked about before, is feeling like you can be your true self, that you don't have to pretend to be somebody you're not, or talk about things that you don't want to be talking about, and that there isn't also that pressure to do that you can kind of open up on your own terms at your own speed, because vulnerability and intimacy can't be forced and it can't be rushed. It's only when that unfolds in a comfortable, organic, safe way that lends itself to closer connections, if that makes sense.
No, it does. Definitely makes sense. I'm actually, while you're saying that, I was thinking of, I mentioned my marketing team beforehand, but you talked about how productivity in the workforce increases when there's friendships in the workforce. If you think about it, if you can trust the people that you're working with and you're authentic with them, the more likely you're going to want to, work with them. And, I think that makes a lot of sense to me, just what you had said.
Yeah,
for sure.
Well, and it's even a catalyst for creativity, right? Because if you trust the people that you're working with, and you feel that sense of psychological safety around them, that you won't be judged in the way that you perhaps fear you might be, or that we all fear we might be sometimes, then you can try out new ideas, right? And you can propose something and see how that lands. And so I think that again, that idea of psychological emotional safety is so important.
Right. You don't have that fear of judgment as you would, right? Awesome.
Yeah, hopefully that's lessened a little bit, because sometimes we all.
Yeah. I'm sure there's still some there.
Yeah, sometimes.
Here's a few of these we've already went through, but here's one from MM. what things are killers of budding or potential friendships?
Oof, I love this question.
It's a good one.
Again, I come back to what we just talked about, right? Feeling like you have to pretend to be somebody you're not, and not being your authentic self, not feeling that sense of psychological safety. Certainly that's one thing. But I think the other piece here is so often we tend to take full responsibility for the success or viability of a friendship, right? We're thinking about it from our perspective. What do I need to do to be friends with this person? What more can I be doing? Obviously, that's helpful because the only thing we have control over is our own behavior and ourselves. But at the same time, it takes two people to develop a friendship. And when we get into that headspace of, I need to do more, I need to do this, I need to keep reaching out, when we don't have that buy-in from the other person, or when we don't have that reciprocity, that's a recipe for resentment or imbalanced relationships. And so I think it's helpful to think about what can I do, but also making sure that we're tuning into, how is this person responding? And am I feeling that reciprocal interest? Because there's actually also some really interesting research showing that up to 50% of adult friendships are not reciprocated.
It's interesting. I was going to ask another question, but I think it follows under the same kind of conversation we just covered. I was asking if you have anything else to add. Yeah. So if you're finding yourself falling into a pattern of codependency with a friend, I guess, what is your advice if you're finding yourself, to falling into a pattern of codependency with a friend? So
if you're feeling codependent with a friend, what can you do, basically? Yeah. Okay. So two things come to mind. The first is what you're doing with this friend. The second is what you're doing in your own life. In your own life, how can you work to practice more independence, making decisions on your own without checking in, regulating your emotions on your own and developing other coping strategies, going to experiences and experiencing life in a more autonomous way. Doing all of that will help you help alleviate a little bit of that pressure that's on the relationship. The second piece is, for any type of interpersonal dynamic, including codependency, it helps to label whatever is going on, right? I'm noticing that we're in this pattern of codependency, right? Is that something that you notice? And inviting that collaboration. So as opposed to blaming the friend or painting a picture of this is exactly what's going on and I see the truth here, approaching it with curiosity and openness. What do you notice? This is something I'm thinking. Do you want to work on this? I think I do. That's helpful, I think, strategy.
I think that's a really good piece of advice. And I think I want to share, Dr. Kirmayer, while everyone has you.
Anything else I want to share? No, I mean, I hope that people feel like they got some helpful strategies. If people are curious to learn more, I talk a lot about this. I mentioned my Instagram community before. I have a newsletter. I have lots of free resources on my website, different articles and interviews and experiences that people can partake in to kind of hopefully get more helpful tips. So everyone's invited to connect. I'd love to connect with you there. But I think that, it's normal to struggle in friendships, and you're not alone in finding this difficult. I think that's the big takeaway.
Awesome. I want to just share, my appreciation, gratitude for you, Dr. Kirmayer. I appreciate you taking the time to talk to me and then everyone else who's joined today. We are going to share a few slides here. So if any would include Dr. Kirmayer's information as well. So if anybody, wants to, I guess we'll start here. So this is an exciting thing. First, we want to share that Meetup is celebrating 20 years of Meetup. So we started 20 years ago from June 14th, and we have a special anniversary offer. So if you want to start a group on Meetup, let's say you haven't found one that is in your local area that is, in your particular interest, and you want to start a group and be the catalyst for that, we're offering a promotion there. So there's a QR code for that in the bottom portion there. And then I want to mention as well, it's going back to, we're going to share in the comments some information from Dr. Kirmayer. So where you can find her, we'll have her website, and you can join her Instagram community, and then sign up for a newsletter. So I think I'm going to actually sign up for that as well. I'd love to see the advice you have to share there. And if we go on to the next slide, we also want to share that, the conversation doesn't end in our Meetup lives. We have other conversations around other topics related to community. So we launched our Keep Connected podcast, with Meetup CEO a year ago. Please take a moment. There's a QR code there as well where you can scan the code and give it a listen. We have interviews from experts from a variety of fields and content, from authors and organizers on Meetup as well, all coming, from conversations with our very own CEO, David Siegel. And hopefully maybe we'll even have Dr. Kirmayer on the podcast at some point as well. And we can have, a larger conversation with her and our CEO. And as a reminder, you can review the recap of this event in a few days on our Community Matters blog. And to get to our blog, it's meetup.com/blog. Very straightforward and easy to remember. I want to thank Dr. Kirmayer again for this great conversation and sharing all this advice. I think this is a powerful friendships is a powerful conversation to have, the conversation around friendships. And hopefully everyone had some great takeaways. So thanks for everyone who joined us today. We appreciate it.